Hi everyone, we're back with a new episode of Faces Behind Papers. In this episode, my guest is Christopher Hopwood. He's a professor of personality psychology at the University of Zurich. He was previously on the faculty of Michigan State University and the University of California, Davis. His work spans several areas, including clinical assessment, personality disorders, interpersonal processes, as well as sustainability and human-animal relations. Thank you for joining me for this episode, Professor Hopwood.
Hey, Rana, thanks for inviting me. And I just want to say you also have a face and have written papers, and I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about you during this thing, maybe make it a conversation. It's two-sided.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, let's see. So as a first step, I would like to first talk about your background a bit to know you beyond your academic work. So going back in years, you had your bachelor's in psychology from Michigan State University, then went on to do a clinical psychology master's and a PhD in clinical psychology. So you were in psychology basically from the beginning. And I was wondering what first sparked your interest in psychology and how did that lead you specifically to clinical psychology? Was this always the dream or did it evolve over time?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's true that when you look at my CV, it seems like I've always wanted to do psychology. That's not the way I experienced it. I was a first-generation college student, and I had never met a psychologist before I set foot on MSU's campus, Go Green, whenever that was, last century. And the first thing you're supposed to do, is to go to advisors and they should tell you what classes you should take and depending on what major you wanted. And I had no idea what major I wanted. And an advisor told me to take this class that I hated, very, very rarely went to, nearly failed. And a responsible person would have learned a different lesson than what I did, but what I learned was never go to advisors. And so I just would look at the course catalog, and it wasn't tightly organized, so like you could take whatever classes you wanted, and I would just look at the course catalog every semester and take whatever seemed interesting, and sort of didn't worry about my future, which is always a good idea as a young person. So then, I sort of messed around for a few years, and then I realized my friends are starting to graduate. I probably have to do that too. And so I went back finally to an advisor. And I was like, so what am I supposed to do? And she said, you could either have a psychology degree or a religious studies degree. And it's a little easier to get the psychology degree. So I said, okay, I'll take it. And so then I graduated. And in the States, it means a little less what degree you have, particularly if it's in the social sciences or humanities, because many people with psychology degrees don't go on to be psychologists. Sort of like, in some ways, it's like a generic bachelor's degree for many psychology majors. So then I traveled and messed around a little bit more, and I was overseas, and I kept finding myself in this weird situation where my friends would be coming back from the bar and I'd be reading Freud or Sullivan or Skinner or whatever, and they thought I was a real dork, and I thought, well, probably that's because I am a dork, and so maybe I should go back to graduate school. So I went to a master's program with very little confidence, hoping maybe I can get through this and become a clinician, which would exceed my childhood expectations by a long ways. And then while I was there, I did a master's thesis with Dave Richard, my master's advisor, on the reliability of the waste, which now to me is sort of a boring subject, but I really liked it. I enjoyed collecting data, analyzing data, writing the paper. And so I applied for a PhD program. I also liked clinical work a lot, so I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm onto something here. And there I sort of settled in, and I sort of found a groove. I found that I was okay at research and practice. I had found my sheep. What I mean by that is if you take a sheepdog to a field that has a sheepdog that's never seen sheep, you take this dog to a field that has sheep in it, right? This dog will run around and collect those sheep and herd them into some place with no previous training, no knowledge. It's just in them, right? So I think I found my sheep by accident. I just stumbled into psychology and it worked out. This is the advice that I give. I mean, to me, it's very natural for young people in their teens, 20s, even 30s to not know what they want to do. And to me, the thing is to try to find your sheep.
Yeah. Very interesting. So you were really interested in reading about Freud and Skinner, in the like the basic psychology books, and then you got back to psychology basically for the masters.
Yeah, I just sort of felt like there must be something. I mean, and when you observe your own behavior, it's like there must be something about the fact that I keep coming back. I'm taking these classes, I'm reading this stuff. So I thought, okay, well, this is probably information. It's better for me to use my behavior as information than to try to make up some career plan with my head.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And as far as what I have observed, like psychologists usually take like two different routes after their graduation, let's say after a PhD in the context of the US. Like either they continue their clinical work, picking a certain therapeutic approach that suits them or that they think is valid, or they stay in research. And what would you say your career leans like more toward? Is it more research, or does your clinical work take center stage? And what really motivated you to embrace these both sides?
Yeah, I really like both clinical work and research. I mean, one of the great things about my position is that you can do many, many different things: teach, research, edit, write, consult, and do clinical work. Just because of the way my career has unfolded, I focus primarily on research, if that includes teaching and editing and things like that. So my day job, I actually don't do any clinical work at the moment because I'm not licensed in Switzerland, and because of other pressing family things, I'm not currently planning to do that in the super near future. But I am passionate about both. I miss doing clinical work. I don't think I could be a person who does clinical work full time because I would miss the diversity of things that I can do. But I am hoping in the next couple of years to start that back up to balance things out a little bit.
Okay. And in your clinical work, do you have like a certain orientation that you, yeah, like what do you say, like obtained, or?
Yeah, I've always resisted the idea of orientation. I find myself being integrative. I've been trained in dynamic cognitive behavioral and various variations of cognitive behavioral therapy. I had a supervision team at MSU that was psychodynamic. But in both cases, I kind of resisted the idea of, I think it's the wrong way to think about psychotherapy. So I think it's really important to listen carefully. And I think it's really important to have empathy and to have an evidence-based formulation that you test along the way. And if you're doing those things, you probably got about as good a chance to be helpful as otherwise. I mean, I do think that most of the people that I've worked with clinically have had personality disorder diagnoses. I'm not really sure what that means, but I think one thing many people sort of hear when they hear that diagnosis is like, this person might be difficult to work with on some level. And I don't experience it quite that way, but what I do find is that I find myself putting myself into traps, meaning that I kind of back myself into a corner where I'm in a kind of like difficult, delicate situation where I'm becoming part of the patient's problem, or I'm sort of feeling the urge to violate a boundary, or there's something where I'm not really sure how to handle it. And so I do think having a good, robust model in your head, whether it's an orientation or a specific package like DBT or mentalization-based therapy or transference-focused therapy or schema-focused therapy, like whatever your favorite thing is, I think those kinds of models are really helpful so that you can think through these situations that you can get yourself in relationships with patients. But beyond that, I think orientation is mostly a waste of time.
Yeah, this was very insightful because I always had this, I was always like perplexed or like confused by this variety of orientations and like models of psychopathology and how they come together in clinicians' work, how like clinicians view the theories of psychopathology and how research really views the clinical part. So it was very insightful.
I think they exist mostly to glorify their creators, right? Like mostly orientations are like, there's some really important person who wrote a book a long time ago, and then a lot of people really like this book, and so they do studies comparing that treatment to waitlist controls, show that it's better because it always is. There's all kinds of ideas about what the mechanisms are and why they're better than some other orientation that are never tested. It's a little cynical, but I don't think it's super cynical. Like we've wasted a lot of resources on this kind of approach to studying psychotherapy, and I don't think it's really gotten us anywhere. So yeah, in general, I think we should stop thinking about things in terms of orientation.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what keeps you motivated in your academic journey? Like, is it curiosity to explore new questions, or a drive to ease the mental suffering, or something else? Some people just have it as, just see their career as a career, as an accomplishment, and that's it. So, um,
Yeah. Well, Zurich is very expensive, and so it helps to have a paycheck.
yeah.
I'm chasing sheep. Like I said before, I would do this job if I wasn't paid. I would be sad if I didn't have enough time to do this job because I had to do something else for money. There's like so many good questions and so few good answers in our nascent field. And like human behavior, what an exciting and interesting thing to study, Like, I can't believe my luck. So it's true, sometimes we might even be useful, like we might learn something important that's new and that lasts. I'm not sure if I've ever done that, but I would like to someday. It could be that some of the things that we do help reduce suffering. Probably that happens a lot less often than we would like to think. So that's kind of the long-term goal, but I don't think you can really aim for that directly. Mostly, I just think it's really fun.
Okay. Yeah. Just enjoying the ride then.
Yeah, you work
Not.
with great
Yeah.
people. You get to study whatever you want. You get to think about whatever you want. It's like challenging, but so yeah, I think it's a really fun job.
Okay. And were there people along the way, like, who shaped your like vision for your career, or like maybe someone that you looked up to and thought, okay, that's who I want to be in the future?
Mhm.
So like, who's had the biggest influence on you?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm in the middle of my career, so looking at the first half of my career, that the thing that really matters to me is relationships that you have. I've had at this point hundreds of collaborators and students and colleagues, and that's really what's given my career meaning. Um, I can't really think of one. Can I give four
Yeah. Yeah.
brief
Yeah. That
hints?
works.
I imprinted on my PhD advisor, Les Morey. So if the question is restricted to who do I want to be like, I would say he's the person that I'm still trying to be like as best I can. I'll never get there, but it's a good target. Aaron Pincus, who I met during my PhD, is like my guru. His model of personality psychopathology and therapy is the one that resonated most with me, and I've had the good fortune to work with him over the years. We just finished a book recently about interpersonal theory. His student, Aidan Wright, is like my academic brother. We came up together around the same time. We've had a lot of fun working together over the years. I guess if I'd only had one answer, Wiebke Bleidorn is my all-time favorite collaborator. She's also my life partner. And the good thing about Wiebke is that she's always right about everything. And so if you ever want to figure out, if you ever disagree with her, it's a useful way to figure out that you've been wrong. Um, but yeah, overall, I mean, these four people, but mostly, like, I imagine on my deathbed, if I'm still, conscious, that's what I'll think about, is all the great relationships that I've had, largely from my career, although not exclusively, of course.
Okay, nice. So you're also writing papers with your partner as well.
Yes, every day we're
Cool.
working together.
And how does that work? Like, is it a, yeah? I'm guessing that it must be a nice experience. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think different kinds of couples make this work differently. I've got friends who are couples in academia and don't work at all together, and I think that's important for them. I wouldn't have imagined this would be ideal. I would have sort of thought keeping work and home separate would have advantages. But for me, it's just, well, I mean, first of all, we complement one another really well. She's smart. I'm not. She's she's careful. I'm not. She's got all of the strengths that I don't have mostly. So I'm not sure what she's getting out of it. But I certainly benefit. I think I'm fast. I guess that's my main strength. Um, but in terms of our life, it just makes things really efficient, right? We can go back and forth between, can you get groceries, to how do you want to analyze these data, to like, what should I do about this postdoc, to do you want, this person wants me to collaborate with them, what do you think? We just go back and forth between like domestic and occupational topics in a way that's super smooth and efficient. I mean, I think she genuinely would be one of my favorite collaborators if we also didn't have a personal relationship. I think we work really well together. So it's just a kind of lucky and we study overlapping topics, right? So all those things kind of came together to make it really make a lot of sense for us to work together.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Really nice. And about your research, so your work spans several areas like personality change, personality disorders, assessment, psychotherapy, and then lastly, like human animal relationships, like sustainability. Could you tell us a bit more about your work in the last bit in human animal relationships and what inspired you to explore this from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think there comes a time like after tenure when almost everybody starts asking them like up to the point that you get tenure, you're just trying to like climb the ladder and secure a position and get paid and stay in the field and figure out where you're going to live and et cetera. And then once you kind of have a sense that this is probably where I'm going to be, this is probably what my career is going to look like, you start asking yourself, yeah, but why? Like, does it matter? Am I ever going to do anything that matters? Is it important? So you get kind of existential. I think almost everyone that I know that I've talked to about this does. Um, and on some very abstract, indirect level, I guess I got into this field because of a kind of narcissistic desire to reduce suffering, probably, or something along those lines. Like you like to make the world a better place, or try, or whatever. And the greatest amount of suffering on this planet by far is experienced by farmed animals. So I just thought, well, that's not something people are doing very much on in psychology. It was a relatively new area. And then when I started looking around, I noticed there's tons of people younger than me, a generation younger than me, who are interested in this topic for social justice reasons, for environmental reasons. And so, yeah, on the one hand, my students and I have been trying to study the reasons that people consume or don't consume animals. We started to study whether it's possible to change that behavior. But mostly, I think my goal is to try to create a platform for young scholars and to try to grow the field. So we started a society, this is a psychology of human-animal interpersonal relations. We started a journal, which is both open access and also free to publish on this topic. And so, yeah, mostly I'd like to kind of build the field up by creating opportunities for the many young people who are doing research in this area.
Okay, nice. And like, what's exciting you most in your current research? Like, are there particular hot topics that you're excited to dig into besides this field that you just mentioned?
I'm pretty distractible. So I mean, if I started with like specific things, and then we'd be here forever. I guess I guess there's kind of two factors, or maybe this is more of a tight model. Maybe there's two clusters. One is more methodological, the other substantive. On the methodological side, our method. I think the longer I've been in this field, the more I've realized that our methods are a massive constraint to knowledge, and that most of the things we're interested in happen at multiple time scales. We often have data collected at often cross-sectionally or at only one time scale. That you need multi-method assessment to get a sense of what the constructs are that you're even measuring. Oftentimes we use mono-method assessment. That many of the processes that we're interested in might be at least in part idiographic, and we almost never incorporate that into our models. So I think one of my general goals is to study a lot of the same topics I have been, but to try to improve the methods so that we can learn a little bit more.
Yeah.
In terms of substantive topics, I mean, all the stuff I've been doing that you mentioned, but I think I've had an interest since I was a PhD student in conflict and ambivalence that I've never really been able to figure out a good way to study. A lot of times we assume kind of linear relationships between variables, or we assume that people can be placed at one spot on a trait. But most of our interesting theories and most interesting psychological dynamics that you observe with your patients don't really, they sort of violate these assumptions. People can be both warm and cold at the same time, or people can both want to trust you and not want to trust you at the same time. So I would love to try to figure out a better way to study that. And there are people who are doing it that that study it in interesting ways. And so I think this is something that I'd like to sort of get into. This occurs to me as a time where maybe I could turn the tables and ask you what your hot topic is. Is that allowed?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So my hot topic is, so in my PhD, I'm looking at so what feeds depression in terms of like from an interpersonal perspective, and more specifically, I'm looking at how value attached to like agency, which is like motives of goals of being in control, being better than others, and how like value attached to communion is feeds into experiences of depression, and whether the manifestation of depression is different for these people. Um,
Well, you're
yeah,
speaking my language. I mean, this is a really good example of what I was just talking about, in the sense that like
yeah,
there's been theories along these lines that you can be depressed either because you feel like you're not good enough, or because you feel like people don't like you, or both. Oftentimes both. Depressed people can think of nearly any reason to feel bad about themselves, but there are these kind of theories that say that there's these two drivers and they cross theoretical orientation, but our methods have been massive constraints. So you working in Leuven with one of the most sophisticated methodological teams in the world are really
yeah.
in a strong position to advance this idea.
Yeah, true, true. I also had the challenge like during the basically the last 1.5 years, when trying to when trying to find a way to study this. So I had trouble like finding like good constructs, questionnaires that measure like motives and goals, whether it's
Yeah.
even possible to really get into that. That was a challenge, but also like disentangling like the frustration of like being better than others, like the frustration of being in control versus being loved by others, whether we can really
Right.
disentangle these two.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Because there's such a negative valence over both of those things that it's kind of discriminant validity becomes tricky.
yeah, yeah.
Your goals are
So
really tricky because they're the most important thing from this perspective. I mean, it's the fact that you're not achieving your goals that makes you feel depressed in the first place. But how do you measure goals? Because I don't know what you want reliably, and I don't believe that you know what you want reliably. So with affect and behavior, you can kind of feel confident in the content validity of measures. But when you're trying to figure out what people are really trying to do, both cognitive and psychodynamic perspectives would say, well, do they really know? Like
yeah,
without a lot of thinking. So how do you measure this in whether it's a questionnaire or an ambulatory measure or some other thing? Like I think it's really hard to figure this question out. But yeah,
yeah.
that's a challenge.
Yeah, like in the beginning, I think people were interested in also like what they call like implicit motives, looking at like TAT, like more trying to
Yeah.
get the motives in an implicit way. But then, are those measures reliable? Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, there's probably
yeah, it's
something
an
to that,
interesting.
but you would
Yeah,
like to do this at a time scale
yeah,
that because the TATs takes a lot of time to get one score. You want to know what people want in every situation that they're encountering,
yeah.
and you can't give them a TAT as- every time.
Every time
I mean, I
point.
guess you could have them tell stories. Maybe this isn't I mean, there's people doing this, having tell stories in a kind of ambulatory context. But it's tricky. Goals are tricky.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so, a question that I really like to ask, if you had all the funding and resources in the world, what would you try to answer slash explore?
Yeah, this is tricky. Um, well, I mean, it's a kind of like cliched answer, but I guess I try to figure out the ways to reduce the suffering of sentient animals, human and otherwise. I think, um, to me, this is not only the most important scientific question; it's the most important question for humanity. Um, I, I have made very little progress. I think we know a lot about the kinds of people who are likely to cause others to suffer. We know a little bit about the mechanisms that enable them to do that. We know almost nothing about how to change that. Um, Probably psychology has a limited artillery, and we'll need to work with people from law and political science, sociology, and other neighboring disciplines in order to get a grip on this problem. So it's not a very specific question. I don't think anybody's going to give me a grant that's titled like "How to Reduce Suffering." But the more I think, as I think about the second half of my career or whatever I get left, every project that I do it has some relation to this general question. And what about you? If you could, what's a question you would answer?
That's a good
Why are
question.
people depressed?
Yeah,
How do you measure goals?
not really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a first step. But if I had all the funding and resources, I think just I'd be interested in the therapeutic process, like
Mm-hmm.
what's really helping people
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
in the therapy, and yeah, whether we when we think a therapeutic approach is effective, is it really effective was it really effective for the person? Um,
Or for the reason that the therapy claims. Don't you find that a lot
ye-
of times you think, okay, I know that it worked, and the book says that this is the reason it worked, but I don't believe that's the reason that it worked.
yeah, and it's hard to test it because like the client or the patient went through this therapy process, and you don't know what would happen
Sure.
if yeah if it didn't. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
that
there's
would
no
be the
within person
question.
control. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like this variety of approaches. You said that you resist to this orientation idea, but at least in the place where I got my bachelor's degree in Turkey, there's this variety of approaches that are still very much like all of them are pursued very rigorously, and then
Hmm.
you find yourself questioning like what's the way, like how do I find my way in this
Totally. Yeah.
so yeah.
It probably, sometimes novelists will give the advice of like, first you should try to write like your favorite writer, and then try a different writer, and then eventually you find your own way. My sense is that like a lot of senior clinicians that I know had a similar thing where they started off like, I'm really an advocate of this is my favorite kind of therapy, and I did that, and then they kind of tried this and tried that, and then they kind of settle into the thing that works best. I mean, this is
That's
to me a big problem with psychotherapy research is that the therapist variance to me is such an important source of information that we very rarely study. We're sort of shy about it, or it would feel bad to show that some therapists aren't good at their jobs, or I don't know what it is exactly, but yeah, this is even harder than figuring out how to measure goals, figuring out why therapy works.
yeah. And it brings me to the question: what do you think? What makes a good psychology study, research? Like, I mean, the surge of the publications. Like some researchers call for better theories and empirical work that relies on more solid theories.
Hmm.
What is your definition of like this? This is like a solid paper.
Yeah, what makes for a good paper?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, well, it's true that our theories are terribly weak. We are super vague about the time scale of processes that we think might be explaining things. The causal mechanisms, we're pretty hand wavy about that. We don't really have the methods that would test those things, even if we were specific about them for the most part. There's some obstacles in the way. I think the incentive to publish a lot makes people want to do easy studies that don't really push things forward all that much. The Matthew effect doesn't help, so the rich get richer, and the person establishes a name, and then people cite them, and there's a sort of thoughtlessness that can take over. I think there are some reasons for optimism. Computational modeling can help. Having dipped my toes in that water, I think it's only kind of able to take small chunks of what's interesting. There's still a pretty big gap between what computational modeling can help us with and the kind of multivariate, multi-timescale processes that we're sort of interested in, but that can help. The access to a lot more data can help. We can now collect data at different timescales using different methods with larger sample sizes than ever before, and that's increasing exponentially. A lot of the best journals have changed their policies and don't allow papers with weak methods, which will hopefully change some of the incentive structures and encourage good work. But I do think there's particularly for people who've kind of established themselves, I mean, I think there comes a point in your career where you realize, like, I've sort of figured out how to write papers. I now have a social network. I know people at journals or whatever. I know that I could just write a paper and send it to would be thought of as a good journal, it will get published. And you can kind of just keep doing that and capitalize on that and build up your citation count and age it thinks and everything like that, um, and not really be doing anything. And so I think there comes a time when one has to have kind of integrity about their own work, and and um, and not write the kind of paper in which there's a scientific veneer. You've collected data, you've analyzed data, it passes all the kind of formal requirements for a good study, but underneath, you and people who know you and read you carefully know it's really just a rationalization for you to express an opinion for or against some idea that you like or don't like. So I try to ask myself, like, are you really curious here, or are you trying to prove a point that you already had? And when I look back at the papers I like the most, usually if I answer yes, then I'm more likely to like the paper.
Yeah, yeah. So really questioning like just a curiosity to know better the human behavior rather than, yeah, this is my
This is
point
where
and I
like
follow it.
really genuine satisfaction comes from doing research, is learning something new that you didn't know what was going to happen and no one else did, and you think like, I think not only learning it new but believing like this will replicate. I think we figured something out. It's usually a very small thing that would be interesting to almost nobody in the world, but for you and your friends, it's like, wow, we figured something new out, and I think it's going to last. I think it's true. This to me is a lot more satisfying than like I figured out a new way to analyze data to prove a point that I've already tried to prove 1,000 times.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And you worked in academia both in the US and in Europe. Now you're in Zurich. I was wondering if you spot any differences in the way people work in academia, or like systemic differences in these two contexts.
Yeah, this is a really important theme because particularly now that people are applying in different countries, it really affects things, and it's not always considered. I noticed that this theme has come up on your pod with a couple of your guests, so I can see that it's also something you spent. I know you've worked in different places, so I guess that's why you think about it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of diversity within Europe. I know mostly about the kind of German system, the German-speaking system, which we also have here in Switzerland, which is a Lehrstuhl model, like a chair model, where basically a professor of some topic will have a team, including assistant professors, postdocs, PhD students, and they'll be kind of responsible for curriculum. They'll be responsible for hiring and managing their team, and it's a fairly hierarchical system. That chair has a lot of power. I think from a sort of organizational perspective, I like it a lot because it reduces tension. You don't have to discuss with your colleagues which graduate students, which should we take, how should we allocate our resources. There's very little competition for resources. It's kind of all established ahead of time, how much each team gets. As long as the chair is good, cares about their team, is productive, then everything goes swimmingly. You know, the main problem with the model, I think, is it's really hard on early career researchers because it's difficult to get these positions. So you end up getting a lot of, like in the States, you can go from your PhD program directly to a professorship sometimes, if not to a postdoc, and then directly to an assistant professorship, and then already be on the tenure track. Whereas here, it's much, in the Lehrstuhl model, it's much more difficult to get a tenured position, and so you end up I know a lot of really talented early career people who've been doing their work for 10 or 15 years still are not sure whether they would get a position. Maybe they're starting families. They don't know if they'd be willing to move to someplace far away and disrupt their family life, et cetera. So I think it's pretty hard on junior people. And I know at our university, we're always trying to figure out like creative ways to sort of reduce that tension while keeping the advantages. If you have a colleague who's just not good, for whatever reason, then they affect a lot more people. Whereas in the States, if you've got a colleague who's sort of who isn't productive or is otherwise undesirable, you can kind of put them in a corner and agree to just leave each other alone. So, you know, I think there's a lot more incentive to collaborate in Europe. There's a lot more funding for like expert meetings and for grants that are multidisciplinary. So I think there's a lot more focus on that. In the States, the social sciences are weird in the States because I think the funding agencies sort of have the implicit view that everyone's at a medical school where there's a lot of resources and incentives to write grants. And in social sciences and psychology departments, that's often not the case. It probably depends on the department. So it ends up being a much more siloed thing where you kind of are trying to write grants to do your own thing. There's not a lot of support for that oftentimes, and you end up writing grants to study stuff you're not actually interested in because you think this is the best way to get funding, which is no way to live a life. Here, I feel like when I write a grant about something that I really want to study, and odds are fair that you might get it. So
Yeah.
I think there's advantages in both places. But they are quite different. They're quite a different experience, particularly for junior people, I think.
Yeah, it's the system here makes it harder to obtain the professorships, like those kind of
Right.
tenure tracks.
Yeah. And so you start
Yeah.
asking questions of like, how long am I going to keep pursuing this versus get off the academic track? I mean, you're a PhD student, so you've got a ways before you worry about this, but I do know a lot of people who are like, well, look, I'd like to be a professor, but I'm either going to have to go live in a place I don't want to live, or I might just never get one, and I'll be, my kids will be leaving the house, and I'll still be trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And so they go do something else, which is a shame.
Yeah, true. And going back to your PhD years, with the current experience you have right now, is there anything that you wish you had done differently? This is a question for me, basically.
Something I would have done differently. It just reminds me of this Oscar Wilde quote that goes like, how'd that go? Most people die of creeping common sense and discover too late that the only things you never regret are your mistakes. So I think I just feel so fortunate to be where I am. It's my career and my life in general is going much better than I would have expected when I was a child. And if you played my life out 1,000 times, this is one of the top 990 outcomes probably. So I can certainly think of many specific things that I should have done better and could have done better. And in that sense, I guess I have regrets. But if on some level you think it's like that butterfly flapping its wings things, like if I hadn't done all those stupid things, I might not be here now. So I guess if I had to choose, I wouldn't change a thing.
Okay.
But I guess I would say you very rarely regret betting on yourself.
Can you talk a bit more about that? The betting on yourself? What do you mean?
There's times when you feel like, well, my heart is sort of telling me this is the thing I should do, but I think the external contingencies are sort of shifting me towards a different decision. And sometimes either one of those things can work depending on the situation. But I think if it doesn't work out and you did what you internally had the sense that like is the thing you should do, you think, well, I bet on myself and it didn't work out. If you sort of bet against yourself and then it doesn't work out, then that's a regret.
Yeah, true. Okay, moving on to the last questions. Who is Christopher Hopwood outside of academia? You can answer it by looking at your behaviors. For example, if you had a free day with no responsibilities, how would you spend it?
Yeah. Well, I have a happy marriage with small children, with actually grown and small children, one of whom is only 5 months old. So if I looked at one of my days recently, it would have a lot to do with taking care of kids and trying to maintain the happiness of my marriage. I do spend a lot of time with family. Actually, the thing I really like about Swiss culture is that family is really central. I'm into the arts, painting and music, visual arts and music, and I'm lucky to live in a time and an age where access to those things are really easy. I like painting and making music myself and consuming that. I like sports. In some ways, along with my family, sports are like my last connection to the United States and my childhood. So I follow American sports pretty closely. And I guess, a lot of people sort of think, what's that thing about like working to live or living to work? A lot of people sort of think of work as a thing you have to do so that you can live a life. I really don't. I mean, I really enjoy my work. I have a hard time, in fact, separating what's work and what's not work because it's enjoyable. I do it with my friends, and so even if I'm on vacation or whatever, I never go a day without doing what many people would think of as work, because it gives my life meaning. So a free day, I don't know what that means, but every day is a free day for me.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like a dream to me. Like that would be my goal in the future. But
I hope and expect you'll get there.
yeah. So my last question, when people think back on your work and your life, how do you hope they'll remember you?
Well, I don't think they'll remember me, and and I'm
No.
grateful for that. If people must remember me, I'd like people to think that I tried to listen carefully, and that wherever I went, I tried to make things a little better than I found them, although with limited success.
Yeah.
How do you answer this? This is a tough question. How do you answer when you're very likely you've got a much longer life ahead of you than I do, but
Yeah.
how do
For
you want to be
me,
remembered?
in terms of work, I would like to be remembered as someone who really put thought into their work, like who was really aware of what other people have done before, and try to sort of build on top of that rather than like recreating like the
Hmm.
same old things.
Hmm.
Um, and in terms of life, just I think if I was like if I remembered like being kind, or like it's a cliche, but it's I think it's important. Um, at least like even now when I'm TAing a couple of courses, and like what's really important to me, if students really say, okay, this person really tried to help us in this,
Uh-huh.
um, and yeah, try to be kind in my emails, stuff like that, you know. Just small things that I think really matters. But yeah.
Yeah, this is nothing to be embarrassed about. You might have already had this. If not, you definitely will. Sometimes you'll get these notes from students, even students you haven't seen for a long time, and they'll tell you how important you were to their life or their development. And it's really one of the most gratifying things that can happen.
Yeah.
These little kindnesses are noticed, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Okay, this was a very enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much for joining
Yeah, I had a good time.
this
Thanks a lot for
episode.
inviting me.
Yeah. All right. Then see you in the next episode.
Bye bye.